Hello everyone and welcome back to my multi-part video series in which I outline my reasons for being an atheist. Now, this is the third video in a series of videos that I'm doing on this topic. And in the last video, we examined 6 pieces of evidence that I argued were more probable on naturalism than theism. And we're going to pick up where we left off. At the end of the last video, I just finished outlining the 6th piece of evidence, which is suffering, the classic problem of evil. And we're going to pick up here by outlining objections to that argument before moving into 4 more pieces of evidence that I think are more likely on naturalism than theism before wrapping up this part of the video. Now, if you haven't watched the other 2 videos in this series, I would highly recommend doing that first because I'm following a general methodology of argumentation here, and the arguments I make, the structure of them won't be as compelling or make as much sense if you haven't watched those previous videos. So I'll leave them in the description. Please go check them out first if you haven't already, and please like and subscribe, follow me on Twitter, and follow my blog in the description below. Without further ado, we'll pick up where we left off. And like I said, I had initially recorded this video and the previous video as one long continuous part, so we're just going to sort of abruptly transition into me addressing objections to the problem of evil as if it had just been connected to the end of the last video. So enjoy, everyone. Okay, so now I'm going to go through a list of common objections to this argument. Obviously, I can't do the full literature on the problem of evil justice here, but I want to go through some of the most common objections to talk about them. So let's start with the first objection, free will. This is probably the most common popular objection to this argument. And it's pretty simple in its bare form. Basically, free will gives meaning to our moral actions and it grants us moral responsibility. However, free will requires the possibility that we abuse it and choose to do evil. Now, God cannot force us to take morally correct actions without violating our free will, and thus suffering is permitted because it justifies the great good of free will and moral responsibility, right? It outweighs the badness of suffering. So because God wanted to allow free will, he had to allow suffering. I have a number of objections to this general theodicy. So the first response that I want to give to this objection is that free will does not account for the vast majority of data that I just cited. There's a whole bunch of data I previously cited that simply does not have to do with free will or that free will doesn't properly explain. For instance, free will does not explain pain or its distribution, in that many morally significant free actions do not entail the existence of pain, such as, for instance, breaking promises or killing. So free will can actually account for the distribution of pain as we observe it. Additionally, if God allows suffering for the sake of free will, that should lead us to expect that pain and pleasure will be even more tied into moral goals, right? Because the very reason that pain and suffering and evil exist, according to this theodicy, is for the sake of this morally significant thing. So we should see that pain and pleasure are highly intimately tied to moral goals. But this is exactly what we don't see. What we see instead, as per my previous argument, is that pain and pleasure are tied to biological goals, not moral ones. So with respect to the data of pain and pleasure, this free will objection actually makes the data even less expected. Also, it's important to note that there's an enormous amount of suffering that has nothing to do with free will that I haven't even mentioned yet. And that's, for instance, natural evil, such as disasters, natural disasters, like tsunamis and hurricanes, or things like illness, disease, decay, death, and especially importantly, suffering amongst animals. Right? Animals have suffered for hundreds of millions of years in extremely horrific ways, arguably more horrific ways than humans because their suffering has been going on for so long, and animals are still regularly subjected to torture and awful things that humans aren't normally subjected to. So this is an extremely significant kind of suffering that theism needs to explain and that free will can't apply to because animals, it's widely supposed, do not have morally significant free will. Now, there are attempts to try and get around this last point I made. One common one I want to quickly address is that you could say, look, natural and animal evil are caused by the free actions of supernatural agents. I don't think this is a very good counter. I can't fully go into it yet, but I want to highlight some issues with it. So first of all, this counter seems to basically admit that naturalism is a better explanation than theism, right? Because on naturalism, you can explain all the suffering, you can explain pain and its distribution without needing to invoke this extra thing, right? You're having to add on this highly ad hoc, implausible supposition to theism that there are all these invisible, immaterial demons or spirits that are actually causing in addition to the physical causes, the pain and suffering we see amongst animals. So this basically admits that naturalism can explain the data better because theism has to explain it given this extra supposition, while naturalism doesn't need the extra supposition. Also, as I just briefly alluded to, there is a problem here with causal overdetermination, right? It seems like we can already explain the existence of pain and suffering amongst animals with reference to physical natural causes, with reference to natural selection and all these things. We don't need to also add in these immaterial spirits who are supposedly also somehow causing the suffering amongst animals. So it seems like you have to basically accept causal overdetermination, which most people regard as very implausible, right? This idea that there are two causes, that both of which would be sufficient on their own to create the effect, but that are both simultaneously sort of creating the effect. And I think this clearly shows that this supposition is speculative and ad hoc, right? It's something that theists are adding in only to explain the data. It's not something that we would antecedently expect on theism. Because if you remember back to the first video in the series, what we're talking about here are antecedent probabilities. That is, how likely is this data independent of the fact that we know it to be true? And independent of that fact, we would never predict ahead of time that there would be all these immaterial spirits who influence in the world in ways that we can't possibly see to cause animal suffering, even though there's no indication or reason to suspect that they are. Plus, this supposition also just has all sorts of questions around it that I think need to be answered. Like, for instance, it involves persons existing without bodies, which fits very poorly with our background knowledge and is something that theists probably don't want to think is likely on theism anyway, because they sort of need to think that persons go together with physical bodies in order to run arguments in favor of theism, like the fine-tuning argument. And then there are all sorts of questions about how these immaterial persons could actually affect the physical world, right? Physics, it seems to me, supposes that we would actually detect any sort of causal influence at the fundamental layer of physical reality, and we clearly don't. So the fact that these immaterial spirits exist and can affect the physical world is highly questionable. We need a more rigorous account of how this would look. So I'm not going to fully go into this counter, but I think you can see that there are a lot of issues with it. And in general, it basically just admits that naturalism can explain the data better. Theists need to conditionalize on evil in order to invent this very ad hoc and plausible addition to theism, while naturalists can simply explain the data without doing that and without assuming all these controversial doctrines about causal overdetermination and immaterial beings and influencing the physical world without having any effect on physics and that sort of thing. Now, the second response I want to give here is that I think that advocates of free will theodicies seriously overestimate the value of free will. So part of the judgment here you need to make, that we've sort of been assuming so far, is that the value of free will outweighs the disvalue that's caused by that free will. So in other words, if free will necessarily requires that they're suffering, then you have to think that free will is worth the suffering that happens. But free advocates often just assume this rather than argue for it. And I think that this is something that can be seriously questioned. In fact, I think many people have very strong arguments to show that the value of someone's free will to commit something horrific like torture or murder or something like that is not only a lot less valuable than, in comparison to the disvalue of the suffering that it causes, but actually an entirely weightless concern. There's an excellent book by Laura Ekstrom I'm citing here that I recommend, where she gives a much more elaborate argument for this. But briefly, just think about your moral intuitions in certain cases. So imagine a universe that is identical to ours, in which we don't have the freedom to torture children. So we still have all the freedoms we have, we still have the exact kind of free will that we have in this universe, but we just don't have that one single ability. We lack the ability to make that choice. Or we're physically unable to make that choice if we tried to. So in some way, we're unable to actually initiate the action of torturing children. This clearly seems like a better universe than ours. And we don't even have to rely on our moral intuitions about universes different than ours. We can actually think about just being in this universe. Suppose that you had a button. I give you a button, and I tell you if you press this button, you can physically deprive someone of their ability to kidnap and kill people. So suppose it's like an active serial killer or something. So you have this button in front of you, and if you press it, they'll no longer be able to make the choice to do that. Do you press the button? It seems clearly like you should press the button. It seems like if you were presented with this button, pretty much anyone would press it. But the implicit value judgment there is that it is more important to prevent these horrific things from happening than to let that person preserve their freedom with respect to that action. And this precisely undermines the rationale behind the free will defense. Indeed, it seems like many of our own moral edicts are incompatible with these implicit value assumptions behind the free will theodicy. If you consider things like the criminal justice system, part of the whole point of the criminal justice system is to say, look, we are depriving you of your freedom because we don't want you to do these horrible things, right? We think it's worth it to take away people's freedom, to limit their choices in certain cases when that freedom is causing horrible things to happen. It would be a sort of absurd world we lived in if we thought that it was more important, if we should value the freedom of the perpetrators of horrible crimes above the horrific things caused by them engaging in these horrible actions. So I don't have time to go into the full argument for this, but I would, again, highly recommend you check out Laura Ekstrom's latest book, where she goes through an extended case for this, and I think it's very compelling. Graham Oppy also mentions it in his 2006 book, Arguing About Gods. So that's that response. The third response I want to give is related to this, and that's that everyone must accept that free will is not so good that it justifies any kind of suffering, even theists. And this is because our will is plainly limited now, such that there are many degrees and kinds of suffering that we actually can't cause, right? It could be the case that every time I lift my finger, I commit a genocide, right? It could be the case also that there are horrible evils that we can't even conceive of that I could be capable of committing. There are many, many choices and actions I cannot make because of physical limitations. And so if God does exist, he's clearly limited what we can do already. So everyone must think that free will is subject to certain reasonable limits. And then this brings us to consider what limits we should expect, right? This is the key question if we want to know what we should expect on theism. What kind of limits to our freedom should we expect? And what I want to suggest is that we should expect that our moral responsibility is limited until we're worthy and ready to handle it. And to justify this claim, I want to consider the analogy of a parent and a child. So suppose that you have a child. Now, presumably you would want your child to be able to express their interests, to play around, to go explore, to some degree without your supervision, right? You want your child to be able to express their freedom and make choices. But there are certain choices you would simply not let your child make. For instance, you wouldn't let your child play with a loaded gun or a knife without your supervision. You wouldn't let your child walk into the middle of the street at night or walk down an empty, dark, alleyway in a city just completely on their own. Now, why wouldn't you let your child do these things? This is because you know that they're not yet ready to handle that kind of freedom, right? They're not yet at the level of responsibility where they can make those kinds of choices. They're not capable of fully understanding the consequences of those choices, and it would result in horrible moral atrocity and danger to that child to allow them to do those things. So what this analogy suggests is that we ought to expect that God permits freedom and moral responsibility on theism to the extent that we're morally ready and capable to handle that kind of freedom. Yet what do we actually observe? What we observe is that people have freedom far in excess of what they're capable of handling, right? Humans have been torturing, maiming, and murdering each other for thousands of years in horrific ways. And clearly our freedom hasn't been adjusted in proportion with our ability to handle that freedom, right? It's not been adjusted in proportion with our abuse of that freedom. And this is what we should expect on theism, just as you would expect a parent to adjust a child's freedom in proportion with how much they're abusing it and how ready they are to handle that kind of freedom. And God could plainly do this by simply limiting certain physical choices we make. And note that this objection isn't saying that we shouldn't have any free will at all, right? God could clearly permit us to make certain kinds of choices and still express our will in certain ways while preventing us from expressing our will in other ways, as he plainly has now in particular instances. So I think this is a very powerful objection to the free will theodicy because it suggests that insofar as we think free will is something God cares about and something God would want to promote, the kind of free will that we observe is plainly not what we would expect if theism is true. So the next response I want to give to free will theodicies is that such theodicies pose problems for belief in heaven. And here I'm drawing from an excellent book by Graham Oppy, where he reprints an article from Yuji Nagasawa and Nitrakakis. The article is The Problem of Heaven, and the book is Arguing About God, so I'd recommend going there for the full argument here. But here's the basic summary. So heaven's meant to be a place with no evil, yet that overflows with incommensurable goods. But if free will requires the possibility that we commit evil acts, then it seems like we don't have free will in heaven, right? Because if to have free will, you need the risk of evil acts, yet there are no evil acts in heaven, there couldn't be any evil acts in heaven, then we could not have free will in heaven. But this would mean that free will is not necessary for the most important goods, right? Because heaven contains the most important goods that are incommensurably greater than the goods here on earth. Alternatively, you might think that free will is possible in heaven. But in this case, it is possible to actualize a world with both free will and no evil, which contradicts one of the premises of the free will argument that to have free will, you needed to risk evil. So either horn that we choose here contradicts some part of the free will theodicy. So I want to consider two quick counters to this argument before I move on. The first would be to suggest that we can freely choose to commit evil in heaven, we just never do because of the presence of God or some aspect of the heavenly environment. The problem with this is it just basically succumbs to the second horn of the dilemma I've given. It admits that you can have both free will and no evil, and so it contradicts one of the premises of the free will theodicy. The second response, which is a bit more sophisticated, is to say it's more valuable to have a world with free will and suffering followed by heaven than to have heaven alone without that prior world. The problem with this response is that it seems to contradict the orthodox understanding of heaven, in which the goods in heaven are incommensurably, that is, incomparably greater than the goods on earth. Because freedom can't be that particularly great of a good if it's infinitesimally lesser in status compared to the goods in heaven. Secondly, if our two choices are A, a world with nothing but great goods and no evil, heaven alone, or that world preceded by a world with the incommensurably lesser good of free will and evil, which the evil would be comparable in magnitude to the value of free will, then it seems eminently unreasonable to prefer the second possibility. Because on that second possibility, we're introducing suffering for the sake of the most infinitesimally small goods, right? Goods that are incrementally lesser than the goods that we just get by having heaven alone. So this counter seems to have problems with the orthodox understanding of heaven. The next response I want to give to free will theodicies is that they tend to rely on a specific view of free will known as libertarianism. Now, there are two prominent views of freedom in philosophy, at least when it comes to accepting that we have free will. One is libertarianism and one is compatibilism. And briefly, the difference between these two views lies in what you think the relevance is of determinism for our freedom and moral responsibility. If you think that we can have determinism, that is to say, we can have all events be caused by prior events, and yet still preserve freedom and moral responsibility, then you're a compatibilist. If you think that the two are incompatible, but you think we still have free will, then you're libertarian about free will. And in this case, you would think that our actions ultimately bottom out in some kind of agent causation, or there's some kind of chancy event if it isn't fully determined by prior causes. Now, the reason I mentioned this discussion here is that if compatibilism is true, then it seems like moral responsibility is compatible with God predetermining our characters and our actions such that we only take the morally correct ones. So in other words, on compatibilism, it seems perfectly fine for us to have freedom and yet have no evil. God can easily just predetermine everything such that there's no evil, and yet we can still have freedom. And compatibilism happens to be the dominant view amongst philosophers. It's also the view I hold to. I don't have time to defend it here. That's for another video. But I just want to point out that if this highly plausible majority view in philosophy is correct, then this entire theodicy is undermined. The next objection I want to address to the problem of evil is soul-making. And basically the idea here is, look, suffering allows for the cultivation of virtues. For instance, courage requires risk, forgiveness requires wrongdoing, and love requires empathy. Right? It seems like in order to cultivate certain virtues, we're going to have certain kinds of suffering. And you might add to this the idea of defeat, which is basically the idea that ultimately suffering is incorporated into a morally valuable whole that could not have been achieved without it, a whole defined by the realization of these significant virtues. So the idea here is that the sufferer will look back on their suffering and be glad it happened because it allowed for this development of their character or this great realization of revelations that they had. So the responses I want to give to the soul-making theodicy. So the first response is that I think soul-making doesn't explain most of the data that I cited. Soul-making, rather than making the biological role of pain and pleasure more expected, for instance, makes it even less expected, right? Because soul-making says that the reason that evil exists is for the sake of developing these virtues, which should lead us to expect that things that have moral qualities, like pain and pleasure, should be related primarily to moral goals, not biological ones, which is what we observe. Additionally, soul-making doesn't explain, for instance, the pain and suffering in the animal world. Now, there are some attempts to try and extend soul-making to animals. For instance, you might say that, maybe lions can show bravery when they jump in and coordinate with members of their pack when hunting, or when an animal goes to save another, member of of the animal's tribe, and they have to risk their life to do so, but they show bravery or courage, or maybe animals can show empathy. However, I think that these attempts to extend soul-making to animals fail for three reasons. First of all, the vast majority of animal suffering has no relation to soul-making, even if you can cite some suffering in the animal kingdom that is related to soul-making, right? The vast majority of it just clearly doesn't cultivate virtues. Secondly, when it does cultivate virtues, assuming now that you can make that claim intelligibly, it can only be said about higher order species like lions and dolphins who actually engage in things like bravery and empathy, not lower order species like insects or just generally lower order mammals who don't seem to show any kind of virtue building whatsoever. Thirdly, I think there's strong reason to think that animals have no propositional attitudes. That is to say, they don't have things like beliefs and desires. That's the wrong way to think about animal psychology. But this undermines the whole case for the soul-making process in animals, right? If animals don't actually engage in things like bravery or empathy, they can't actually cognize propositions, then the extent to which we can extend our virtue-building process to them looks completely unintelligible. Now, you might want to expand this particular response by saying that, look, the soul-making that animals experience will continue in the afterlife, where they might be given rational natures, right? This is a claim that Trent Doherty sort of makes in his book, and that some people I've engaged with on this channel before actually make. The problem with this is that it looks highly implausible that such a thing would be the case antecedently, right? It doesn't seem like we can predict ahead of time, prior to knowing that animals suffer in these great degrees and kinds, that it's likely that the kind of suffering animals experience is the kind that would allow for defeat in the afterlife. Think about something like a fawn slowly burning to death, or a seal being mauled to death, or a caterpillar being eaten from the inside out. What will they possibly have to look back on and be glad that happened about? Right? We have absolutely no idea what that would look like. What virtue does that cultivate? What does it even mean for animals to transition to rationality in the afterlife and look back on these things? It seems like their personality would be so far removed from their form on Earth that's in such a lower order sort of space that it's completely unclear how they'd even be able to look back and be glad that happened, even if they are given rational natures. It just seems so clearly antecedently implausible and ad hoc. Now, I'm not denying it's possible. Of course, it's possible that animals might be given rational natures and be able to defeat evils that exist in the afterlife. But again, antecedently, prior to the data, we have no reason to suspect that the particular kinds of horrific evils amongst the animal kingdom are those that are ripe for defeat in the afterlife, just because there's no visible soul-making that's going on with animals, unlike in humans where you can plausibly claim that it might continue. So certainly you can posit it, but it looks highly antecedently unlikely on theism. So the next response I want to give to the soul-building theodicy is that it leads us to expect that suffering will be permitted insofar as it permits the development of virtues, right? That's the whole reason suffering is meant to exist. But this is not even close to what we observe. In most cases, actually, what we see is that suffering leads to destruction of people's characters, right? Suffering is often soul-crushing rather than soul-building. Often, I would actually say more often than not, suffering leads people to develop worse vices and actually get worse down the line rather than better. And this is precisely in contradiction with what we would expect if we can join theism and soul-making. Now, the obvious counter to this is that soul-making will continue in the afterlife, right? Soul-making doesn't end here, and in the afterlife, all suffering will be defeated. The problem with this claim, though, is that, first of all, prima facie, the conjunction of theism with that hypothesis that evils defeated in the afterlife is compatible with any amount of suffering that we might observe, right? Take theism and conjoin some set of evils are defeated, and then try and predict that set of evils, and you'll be able to predict it. So in other words, it means that theism doesn't predict any kind of range or distribution of evils that we see. Imagine a world that consisted only of billions of people experiencing horrible, grotesque suffering and torture. Now, if we conjoin, if we say theism plus that evil will be defeated, then that becomes compatible with theism. But that's obviously absurd. So the onus is on the advocates of soul-making to explain what kind of distribution of evils you would expect on theism, in the sense that what kind of distribution of evils are more likely to be defeated relative to other kinds of distributions of evils. So yeah, we need reason to think the evils we see are uniquely defeasible. But do they seem to fall into this category? I would argue no. First of all, most suffering is such that we have no idea how it will be defeated. For instance, I already cited horrific suffering amongst animals. And even very horrific suffering amongst humans is such that we have a strong moral intuition that it cannot be justified or defeated, right? Many moral principles and our moral intuitions imply that the most grotesque suffering that exists, things like torture and rape and sexual assault and abuse, are such that there is no morally valuable whole in which it can be justified. Someone can only come to be convinced that it's justified by being able to remove them far enough from the situation such that they really aren't taking the horror that the situation contains seriously. So I think that we have strong reason to think the evils we observe are not uniquely in a category where they can be defeated relative to alternative distributions of evils. The next response to the soul-making theodicy I want to give is derived from an excellent paper from Stephen Mason, where he comes up with this highly plausible moral principle. And that is, if suffering is all things considered good for the sufferer, that deprives us of our moral obligation to intervene and prevent suffering. Right? To take a common sense example, suppose that you see a baby being injected with a highly painful needle and they're screaming and it's horrible for them. Now, presumably, if you didn't have any other information, that would be a time where you should intervene and stop the suffering. That seems like a pretty basic moral obligation that we might have. But now, consider that you learn that, in fact, that suffering is related to goods down the line that, on the whole, are going to be positive for that sufferer, right? Necessarily, that suffering is such that necessarily it's connected to these greater goods that justify it. For instance, suppose in this case that you learn that them being injected by that needle is going to cause them the prevention of horrible suffering down the line, like they're not going to have succumbed to serious illness and decay or have some horrible experience down the line. Now, it seems pretty obvious that this would deprive us of our moral obligation to intervene and stop that suffering. If anything, it would give us reason to promote that suffering or be glad that that suffering happened. But analogously, if we take soul-making seriously and we're a theist, we must think that the most horrible suffering is such that this is true, right? We must think that suffering is such that it's never unjustified. It's always related to some greater whole down the line that justifies it. And this is especially true for the most horrific suffering, right? The most horrific suffering must be the suffering that is most intimately connected to the greatest kind of goods, because only the greatest kind of goods could justify such suffering, such that when you look back on the suffering, you're glad it happened because it allowed for these great things, or it was incorporated into these greater states of affairs. But this would seem to, at a minimum, deprive us of our moral obligation to intervene and stop that horrible suffering that occurs. Because every time we see the most horrific suffering occur, if we're a theist and we buy into this theodicy, we have to think, look, hey, that suffering is going to be such that later on the sufferer will be glad it happened, and it will be so good down the line. And that's obviously absurd. That kind of moral paralysis is not tenable, and so this is a serious problem for soul-making. The next response to soul-making theodicies I want to give is that soul-making advocates suffer from a lack of imagination with regards to how virtues might be cultivated in the absence of serious suffering. It seems like there are many ways in which we could get the virtues that soul-making advocates talk about without the most horrific suffering. So, for instance, courage and perseverance could come from humans working hard to finish long-term projects like academic dissertations or during sporting events. Compassion and empathy could arise through people who support others engaging in these hard projects. Generosity and charity could come about when teachers and students support each other in their academic projects, or when mothers care for their infants. Now, you might think that there's a little bit of suffering that's necessary here, but clearly not the kind of horrific suffering that is the most problematic for the problem of evil. And even if the threat of serious suffering is necessary for the cultivation of virtues, this could still come about through the use of realistic dreams or visions that involve immense hardships, right? You can imagine that God teaches us lessons or helps us build virtues during these dreams or visions, but it doesn't happen in real life, which would obviously be preferable to the world in which we live. Now, what soul-making advocates will likely want to say is that none of this is enough to develop the highest manifestation of virtues, which is what they want to say is the really, really good thing here. However, I disagree, and it's on them to show the logical necessity between these things. And I think we actually have two strong reasons to suspect that there is no necessity here. First of all, if it's really the case that we need to have, to get a higher manifestation, you need a more intense degree of suffering, it's not the suffering that God necessarily needs to change. It could also be our psychologies, in other words, how we react to certain scenarios. What God could have done is adjusted our psychology such that we more strongly react to these lighter scenarios I've mentioned, so that we properly develop the necessary virtues of the highest manifestation of these virtues. Secondly, horrific suffering just looks disproportionate relative to what is necessary to develop virtues. We can obviously get all the most important virtues without the most horrific moral evils like rape, torture, and genocide, and the intensity with which they're experienced. It doesn't seem like those are at all necessary for the highest manifestation of virtues. The fifth response I want to give here is that advocates of soul-making theodicies seriously overestimate the good of going through hardship in general. So there's this old mantra that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, but I think that this is actually psychologically backwards. What we know through a variety of empirical studies and through our understanding of modern psychology is that actually going through trauma and hardship makes you more mentally unhappy, unsound, and vulnerable. And this is especially true for the worst evils, which are precisely those evils that are most important for theodicists to address. So I think this is a serious problem for soul-making because, in fact, we have evidence that prima facie badness is correlated with worse evil down the line, not the defeat of evil. So if we're taking the testimonial and empirical evidence seriously, it seems to cut against the theist in ways that are very bad for the advocate of this theodicy. So the final objection I want to give to soul-making is the idea that soul-making is an intrinsic good that justifies suffering is in tension with other theistic doctrines. For instance, consider the question of why humans couldn't simply be built with virtues rather than needing to slowly form them for time. So in other words, why couldn't God just start us out with things like bravery, perseverance, and empathy rather than making us slowly form them? The intuition is going to be that there's something better about slowly forming them than simply starting out with them. But now consider the fact that God is thought to be maximally morally praiseworthy and morally perfect. Yet God never had to go through any soul-making process. So if the idea is that it's more praiseworthy to go through the process of building these virtues than starting out with them, that would seem to imply that the virtues we have are somehow more praiseworthy or better than the virtues that God have. Yet this is in tension with the doctrines of orthodox theism. Second, if the soul-making process requires suffering, it will presumably end in heaven. Thus, we face a similar kind of tension as we did with free will between the soul-making theodicy and the idea of heaven. If the process of soul-making is so valuable, why doesn't it continue in the state where the best possible goods are realized, that is heaven? It seems like the goods in heaven are incommensurably better than the goods on earth, which seems to imply that the soul-making process must be extremely marginal in terms of its value, since it's incrementally worse than the goods that exist in heaven. Now, you might say, well, it's still valuable to build them over time, and then enter into heaven with them. But it seems like if these virtues, assuming the assumptions that the soul-making theodicist generally tends to make, require suffering in order to actually use them, right? In order to manifest things like bravery and courage and empathy, we need suffering. That's the whole point of soul-making in a way. But in heaven, there will be no suffering. So it seems like we'll never be able to exercise or utilize these virtues in a significant way. But what's the point in even building these virtues if we never get to exercise them or use them? And if you want elaborations on this point, check out my blog post, and even more ideally, check out an article I cite by Stanley Kane, where he outlines this problem in depth in a way that I think is very compelling. So that's it for soul making. Now let's move on to skeptical theism. So skeptical theism is basically an approach to the problem of evil that doubts our ability to infer that the evils that we see are unjustified. So certain versions of the problem of evil rely on a kind of inference from the fact that there don't seem to be any good reasons why God would allow suffering to the conclusion that there are no such good reasons. And you can doubt this on a variety of epistemological grounds. There's this principle called chronia that roughly says you're only entitled to claim that it appears P if it be reasonable for you to believe that, given your use of cognitive faculties, if P was not the case, the situation you're in would have been discernibly different than the one that you're in now. So, in other words, imagine that it was the case that there were God-justifying reasons for the evils that we see. Would that be discernible to us? If that were the case, would we, by use of our cognitive faculties, be able to realize or see that there were? It seems like we wouldn't. And so the idea here is that this undercuts this inference, this noseum inference that is made in certain versions of the problem of evil. So you can give arguments for this kind of principle. So God seems to have a mind far removed from our own. His reasons and motives are hard for us to comprehend. You might use the analogy of a parent and a child and say, look, sometimes a parent has to let a child suffer, but the parent can't explain why the child must suffer because the child simply wouldn't understand. Now, my first problem with this argument is that this objection is to a certain kind of inference, right? It's specifically to a certain kind of inference that moves from the appearance of a lack of God-justifying reasons for evil to there being no God-justifying reasons for evil. But many versions of the problem of evil, including mine, make no such inference, right? My inference is an abductive inference directly based on the kinds of suffering that we see, not from our lack of ability to explain the kind of suffering that we see. So it's simply not applicable. Now, what you'd want to do, and what skeptical theists have done, is adapt the general point made by the skeptical theists into a kind of principle that could undermine abductive arguments. So here's an example taken roughly from Bergman, who's a prominent skeptical theist. So consider this kind of principle. Our utter ignorance of the ultimate connections between various goods and evils implies an inability to antecedently evaluate the likelihood of God justifying reasons for the evils we see, thus undercutting the ability to estimate the probability of the evidence on theism relative to alternatives. So the idea here is we're so ignorant about the various connections between goods and evils that we can't estimate the probability of the evidence on theism. There could be these unknown reasons, these unknown God-justifying reasons out there, and that leaves us in the dark about this particular probability. So I have a few problems with this. First, I think the inference present in the adjusted skeptical theist principle is false for two reasons. First of all, ignorance of the connections between goods and evils is no more likely to antecedently generate unknown reasons for God to permit evil as it is to generate unknown reasons God has to prevent evil. So remember here that the probabilities are antecedent. So we're asking what we expect about the evidence independent of the fact that we know the evidence to be true. And independent of the fact that we know it to be true, it's equally possible that there are unknown greater goods that entail the prima facie evils that we're familiar with, as that there are either unknown lesser goods that entail those prima facie evils, or unknown lesser evils that entail those prima facie evils, or unknown greater evils that entail those prima facie evils. In fact, in virtue of there being three possibilities on which the goods are not justified, and only one possibility on which they're justified, it seems that the unknowns actually slate towards the good not being justified. Thus, the unknown reasons cancel out. We have no reason to regard the unknown reasons as favoring or disfavoring theism, and we're left with the known reasons that we know God has for disfavoring evil. So this objection basically says, antecedently, we have to leave the unknowns as the unknowns because they don't cut in favor of theism or against theism. They may help theism, but they also may hurt theism. The second problem with this inference is that it would be wrong to draw the conclusion from the skeptical theist principle that the probability of the evidence on theism is inscrutable relative to alternatives. And this is because of the specificity of the data. The distribution of suffering that we observe, including all the facts I cited about it, is extremely specific, right? There are many, many ways that the distribution of suffering could have looked, and the particular outcome that we see is extremely unlikely just in virtue of that specificity. And thus it's extremely antecedently improbable on theism, not inscrutable, independent of any kind of reasoning, before you even bring in reasoning based on the background knowledge. But reasoning on that background knowledge raises the probability of the evidence on naturalism, but not on theism. So I think that the applicability of the skeptical theist argument to arguments like Paul Draper's is highly, highly questionable and doesn't actually work. Now, of course, there are ways to doubt these sorts of arguments. You might, for instance, when it comes to this first response that I've offered, you might try and offer some reason to doubt this idea that we should think that the unknowns cancel out, but I've looked into those particular reasons that are given, and I don't find them compelling, but I'll hopefully go into that when I do a sort of full deep dive into skeptical theism. I'm hoping to do a video just on skeptical theism at some point where I really dive into these issues, but this should give you a hint of my problems with this first inference. Okay, my next response is that suppose now that we grant that the evidence is inscrutable on theism, or that it's unknown whether theism predicts the data. The fact that it's unknown whether theism predicts the data, but known that naturalism does, can itself be turned into a Bayesian argument for naturalism. And here I'm citing the work of Michael Tooley. So to understand why this is the case, I'm not going to go through this entire derivation. You can pause the video and look at it. But basically, when you consider the probability of the evidence on naturalism, that's greater than the probability of the evidence on its own. And so just following the Bayes' theorem, what we can find is that the probability of naturalism given the evidence is greater than the probability of the evidence in the background. And so we can show that naturalism, this evidence raises the probability of naturalism greater than it would have been without this evidence. But this means that we know that the evidence raises the probability of naturalism. But according to the skeptical theist's own point, we don't know the value of the probability of the evidence on theism. And we don't know how that value compares with the probability of the evidence on its own. And this means that the probability of the evidence on theism cannot be part of our total evidence, which means that the evidence does raise the probability of naturalism, but it cannot raise the probability of theism. So the fact that it's known that naturalism predicts the data, but unknown whether theism does, is itself an argument that can be used for naturalism. And so even if we conceded that the probability of the evidence on theism is inscrutable, this wouldn't totally undercut the argument from evil here. My next problem with the altered skeptical theist principle, remember there's the original one that doubts a certain kind of inference, and then there's the altered one that applies to the abductive argument from evil. Now my problem with the altered skeptical theist principle is I think it would destroy theism as an explanatory hypothesis. So this is basically a restatement of that altered principle. You can look back at the one that Bergman sort of uses to undermine Paul Draper's argument from evil, but now here I'm just swapping out evil for fine-tuning. And take a look at this principle. Our utter ignorance of the ultimate connections between God's design decisions and other goods, evils, and values implies an inability to antecedently evaluate the likelihood of God justifying reasons against fine-tuning the constants of the universe, thus undercutting our ability to estimate the probability of fine-tuning on theism relative to alternatives. So the idea here is the same idea behind the other principle, right? If the fact that unknown reasons that God might have for permitting or not permitting certain features of the universe undermines our ability to evaluate the probability of those features on theism, this applies just as much to fine-tuning as it does to evil. Independently of fine-tuning, God could have unknown reasons for not fine-tuning the universe. And so if those unknown reasons render the probability judgment inscrutable, then it's going to destroy the fine-tuning argument just as much as it destroys the argument from evil. So things cut both ways here. But it gets even worse than this, because it seems like the same point is going to apply to virtually any datum one might cite, right? Take this principle and swap in any kind of data that you might want to evaluate on theism, and it seems like this is always true. There's always the possibility of reasons beyond our ken that God has for doing things. So if that possibility makes that data inscrutable on theism, that's going to mean that theism basically can't explain any data whatsoever, which would render theism completely devoid of explanatory content. So insofar as skeptical theists want to use these kinds of principles in order to undermine the problem of evil or undermine similar arguments for naturalism, not end up hurting theism, they're going to need to, first of all, come up with a version of skeptical theism on which you can still make predictions, but then also narrow that version of skeptical theism such that it uniquely undermines arguments for naturalism like the problem of evil, but not arguments for theism. But I suggest that there's no way to do this without coming up with a principle that looks absurdly ad hoc, implausible, and obviously concocted just to defend theism. So I think skeptical theism faces very serious problems. It looks to me like it's going to end up damaging theism as an explanatory research program. And if we still can save theism and make predictions with the skeptical theist principle, then it seems like we're just going to be able to use the alternative mode of reasoning that's compatible with skeptical theism to run similar arguments as the ones I make in this video. And it's a heavy, heavy burden for the skeptical theist to show how this is undermined. And not only would this make skeptical theism completely destroy theism as an explanatory research program, it would also force us all to rationally commit to agnosticism at the very minimum. And to see this full argument, I highly recommend an article by Nevin Clemenhaga, who goes into this in depth. But note briefly that the probability of, for instance, fine-tuning or evil on theism is going to affect the probability of theism given the evidence, right? The probability of the evidence on theism affects the probability of theism given the evidence. So if the probability of the evidence on theism is unknown or inscrutable, then we have to conclude that the probability of theism given the evidence is also unknown or inscrutable. But that would imply that we all should be agnostics, which is obviously something I would presume skeptical theists would want to avoid. So I think this is a very serious problem for skeptical theism insofar as you attempt to modify it to apply to abductive arguments. The third response I want to give here is that skeptical theism rests on shaky epistemological ground and arguably opens up the theist to a whole host of problems. So there are many, many, many articles on this. I'm not going to fully go into them. Here, again, I'm planning on doing a video where I sort of deep dive into skeptical theism to address these arguments and see which ones I think work and which ones I think don't work. Here are some good sources to check out if you're interested in these arguments. But for instance, authors have argued that skeptical theism opens up the ground to moral paralysis, skepticism about the Word of God, and even global skepticism about even more fundamental matters. And how successful they are is going to be dependent on how good their arguments are. But as I said, I'm not going to fully go into that here, but I am going to just give you a general taste of the epistemological challenges that underlie skeptical theism and show why I think that even before you modify the skeptical theist principle to try and apply to abductive arguments, there are already issues. So I'm just going to take an example from one of these papers to give you an idea of what these challenges look like. So consider the claim that the Earth was not created 6,000 years ago. Now suppose God had a good reason for making the Earth appear as if it was created more than 6,000 years ago, even if it wasn't. For instance, and this is something Richard Swinburne has even suggested, perhaps God wanted us to learn from the lessons of history and natural evil. But perhaps at the same time, God wanted to avoid the horrendous evil required for the Earth to actually have its long history. So this is a reason God might have for making the Earth appear as if it was created really, really long ago, even though it was actually created 6,000 years ago. Now, if God did have such a good reason, then it would seem like we would not be in a position to know it. Or this is exactly the kind of situation that skeptical theists use to justify their skepticism. Thus, it seems like if we're unjustified in concluding that evil is evidence against theism from the fact that God could have a good reason for it, we would not be aware of. We are also unjustified in concluding that the Earth is older than 6,000 years old from the fact that God could have a good reason for deceiving us about it that we would not be aware of. So obviously, there's ways to try and respond to this argument. You might say, look, we have independent grounds for affirming that the Earth is older than 6,000 years, but it seems like what works for, if skepticism is valid in one area, the exact same principle can be used to undermine knowledge in other areas. So this gets into some complicated discussion that, again, I'm not going to go into, but this should give you a taste of the sort of epistemological problems that skeptical theism has here. Now, to get into the nitty-gritty of the problems with the skeptical theist principle, let's explicitly state cornea, which is the sort of principle I've implicitly been talking about here. This is the original principle now, not the adjusted one that applies to Draper's argument. I think even their original principle is problematic. So the explicit statement of it is, on the basis of cognized situation S, human H is entitled to claim it appears that P, only if it is reasonable for H to believe that, given her cognitive faculties and the use she has made of them, if P were not the case, S would likely be different than it is in some way discernible by her. So that's a big mouthful, but in essence what that says is our cognitive situation is only evidence for some fact. If it's reasonable to believe that, if that fact were not the case, our cognitive situation would be different from what it is now. And this is meant to be the case with evil, because if it were the case that the evils we see are justified, we wouldn't be in a situation to know that. Now, this is a kind of sensitivity condition on our beliefs. So our belief that P is sensitive only if not P, or if not P, then it wouldn't be the case that we believe that P. The problem is these sensitivity conditions are highly controversial and they have problems. So, for instance, consider the following situation. I have a ticket for the lottery and I believe that I will not win it. That seems like a justified belief. But now note that my evidence that I will not lose the lottery is not sensitive to my belief. Right? If I were in the world where I win the lottery by luck, my cognitive state would not be discernibly different. So according to Cornea, our belief that we will lose the lottery in this situation is not justified, but this is clearly absurd. As a second example, suppose someone were on trial and they used the following defense for murder. Aliens who can only contact me and me alone made me commit this murder. And as I went to commit the murder, they switched me out with an alien double who actually committed the murder. Now, sure enough, it appears that this isn't the case. But now, suppose that it were the case that my story is true. Then your cognitive situation would not be discernibly different than it is, since by hypothesis, these aliens can only contact me and influence the situation in ways that you would not have noticed. So again, Cornea seems to imply that we're not justified in our belief that this person committed the murder. But clearly, we are justified in that belief. And for more on this, please check the McBrayer paper, which I forgot to cite here, but I'll make sure to cite in the description, where he goes through scenarios like this. So clearly, I think Cornea is highly problematic. Now, obviously, there's more to say. There's ways to adjust this principle. This just gives you a taste of the sort of epistemological challenges that underlie skeptical theism. So I think skeptical theism, even the bare skeptical theist principle, before you even try and modify it to apply the kind of argument I make, has serious problems. So the next piece of evidence I want to examine is the ineffectiveness of prayer. So here I am referring to a whole set of scientific studies and meta-analyses that have been done on intercessory prayer, that is praying on behalf of someone else, that have found that prayer makes no relevant difference in the world, right? People who are ill and prayed for are no more likely to recover than people who are ill and not prayed for, as an example. And you can look into the studies if you're interested. Now, we have to distinguish between two different ways in which prayer could actually be effectual, actually make a difference to people. Because, of course, both naturalism and theism are compatible with prayer making, for instance, a psychological difference to those praying, right? It's known that if there are people who are supporting you in your community, or if you feel psychologically better, you're more likely to recover, in fact, and that if you're feeling psychologically worse off, that can actually harm or delay your recovery, right? Your psychology actually has a powerful influence over your general physical health. So, of course, prayer can make an indirect sort of psychological difference, but only on theism and not on naturalism is there a way for prayer to be supernaturally effectual, right? That is to say that on theism, there's actually a way for God to directly intervene and cause prayer requests to be fulfilled, or ensure that miraculously, through natural means, people who are prayed for just happen to recover at much higher rates than people who are not prayed for. Right? So on theism, there are these additional ways in which prayer can be fulfilled that aren't these sort of indirect psychological routes that are not possible on naturalism. And this alone shows that the probability that prayer would be ineffective is higher on naturalism than theism, because only on theism could prayer be effective in this relevant sense that I've just talked about, which is precisely what we don't observe. Now, we can actually boost the strength of this probability judgment by citing reasons God would have to answer prayer requests, and I think we do have at least one good reason, and that's that we think that part of theism is that God is all-loving, right? And part of being all-loving seems to me to be having a desire for the wishes and hopes of your loved one to be fulfilled, right? If you love someone, then you want their aims to be fulfilled. You want them to achieve the desires of their heart. So you actually have a reason to intervene and grant prayer requests, especially in the lives of people who most need their prayers to be answered. But of course, what we observe is exactly the opposite. There's no clear pattern of prayers being answered at all, and people who mostly need prayers to be answered certainly don't clearly have their prayers answered. So for this reason, we have additional reason to suspect that the probability of the ineffectiveness of prayer being the case is much lower on theism relative to naturalism, because there's actually this reason that God has to want to fulfill prayer requests. And I should note that the data here is relevantly different from the problem of evil, because usually the kind of suffering that is invoked in the problem of evil that's meant to sort of be forceful is suffering that's really, really horrific and soul-crushing. But often prayer requests don't involve this kind of suffering. Sometimes they do, but prayer requests often just involve things that people want or wishes that people have. They're not usually the sort of data that are taken to create a strong problem of evil, but I think they can create a strong argument from the ineffectiveness of prayer. So that's the argument from the ineffectiveness of prayer. Now moving on to the argument from religious diversity, I'm going to consider two categories of data here. So first of all, there's been no dominant religion throughout history. Rather, religions have drastically differed across various times and places. Now, if naturalism is true, religion is a byproduct of our evolutionary mechanisms combined with culture. Right? If you remember back to the evidence from the cognitive science of religion, the way that religion proliferates is through these credibility-enhancing displays within a culture. So you see people who are, in a high authority position or huge trust, engaging in these displays, these credibility-enhancing displays, and displaying these religious ideals, and so you adopt those same religious ideals. And of course, there has a general mechanism for us to cognize and reason about agents and to engage in costly signaling. So all these mechanisms make it likely that we're going to come to have religious beliefs. But it would be nearly impossible for all cultures to converge on the same theistic concepts, right? Because it's just a byproduct of culture and evolution, and culture and evolution are going to mix together lots of different concepts and ideas, right? You're never going to converge on exactly the same religion. That would be highly, highly improbable on naturalism. On the other hand, if theism's true, there is a significant reason to think that God would make theism a live option across times and cultures. And this is because belief in God has tremendous significance, and a relationship with God is meant to be a deep good, right? If theism is true and if God exists, it's actually plausible that the deepest and most important good that you could achieve would be a relationship with the ultimate exemplar of moral value, of meaning and purpose in the world. And so God has an extremely strong reason to make access to this concept accessible to people across times and cultures, right? Because doing this would permit everyone to have access to a deep good of such tremendous significance, which is something God would want to do. So on theism, but not on naturalism, we have significant reason to think that at least theism will be a live option to people across times. So no, I'm not saying here that God should force everyone to believe in him or anything, but just that the concept should be around and much more predominant across times and cultures than it is. Instead, what we see is that over time, what religion is available or around has drastically differed. It seems much more like religions are the byproduct of cultural conditioning and evolutionary mechanisms than anything that's true, considering how they break off and change with time and evolutionary forces. Okay, the next category of data I want to consider is that what religion one participates in is usually determined by cultural and familial circumstance, not earnest truth-seeking, right? So what religion you end up adopting is much more likely to be just the result of luck, right? What society you happen to be born into, not actually the actual earnest seeking of truth or rational inquiry. Now, if naturalism is true, we have very significant reason to expect this, because, like I mentioned, the mechanism through which religion has proliferated is this cognitive science of religion evidence, right? So things like credibility-enhancing displays from people within one's culture and costly signaling, and these are going to lead to adherence of the religion of the in-group, right? These mechanisms are precisely designed so that you end up buying into the same ideas, the same religious ideas as your in-group has. So this gives us very strong reason to expect that on naturalism, you're going to adopt the religion of the society that you're born into. There's an additional reason to think that this is very unlikely on naturalism, and that's that theism is false on naturalism, right? So, of course, earnest seeking isn't going to reliably lead to religious belief, because if you earnestly seek the truth through rational inquiry, if theism is false, then you're not going to end up reliably believing in theism on the assumption that naturalism is true. However, both of these inferences are undercut on theism. First of all, on theism, of course, religion is actually true. So we have a reason to think that earnest seeking and rational inquiry will reveal the truth, will really reveal theism. And additionally, God has strong reason to want religious belief to come about more often from earnest seeking than luck. And this is because luck is usually thought to be a morally irrelevant, arbitrary factor. So God would not tie a good of such tremendous significance as belief in him, as a relationship with him, to something completely morally irrelevant like luck, right? It's much more probable that God would tie this to a virtue, like actually earnestly seeking the truth. So it seems very bizarre on theism that what religion you end up adopting, what belief you end up having, is completely the result of this cultural conditioning and luck rather than earnest seeking. God has significant reason to have the opposite be the case, that earnest seeking is what leads you to get into the right religion, not just like what family you're born into. Okay, so that is the argument from religious diversity. The next argument I want to examine is the argument from flawed religions. So there are three categories of data here I want to consider. First, religions have variously been a force for both good and bad in the world. Everyone's sort of familiar with these examples, so I'm not going to go through them extensively. Everyone knows that there are lots of horrors that have been caused by religion, and of course lots of good things that have been caused by religion. Secondly, holy texts are highly inconsistent, right? Holy texts contain a mix of ethically good, interesting information, but also ethically horrific, incorrect information. For instance, in Christianity, you can find lots of good moral teachings that Jesus said many insightful things, but you can also find really, really ethically horrific information, outdated information, scientifically inaccurate information. And all holy texts look like a mixed bag. They're not highly impressive in the way, they're not highly impressive, clearly above and beyond other texts of other religions. Thirdly, adherence to theism does not impressively lead people to lead more ethical lives. Right? So just because you believe in God, that doesn't have any clear association with you therefore being a lot more ethical of a person. There are plenty of people who adopt religion and as a result of religion improve their lives and all of a sudden end up living much more virtuous lives. But there are, of course, stories of the opposite, people who adopt religions and end up leading much worse lives as they were influenced by their religion. And of course, there are many atheists and agnostics who live perfectly good lives filled with virtue and filled with good moral fruits. So, in other words, theism has meager moral fruits. There's no clear association between believing in God and ending up being a particularly ethical person. Now, if God has revealed himself through religion, we have reason to doubt that all this is the case. So on theism, it's plausible to think that God will reveal himself. And this leads us to expect that the religion that correctly portrays God should be impressive. After all, the religion that portrays God is based on the ultimate moral exemplar, right? The ultimate source of purpose and meaning and value. Therefore, the religion that displays this God should be highly, highly impressive relative to other religions. The teachings of this religion should stand out, and yet this doesn't seem to be what we see, right? There's no particular religion for which the holy texts are extremely impressive relative to the others, or for which its adherents are much more ethical than the adherents of other religions, or for which the institution of that religion has been much more a force for good than bad compared to other religions. So I think that the fact that religions are such a mixed bag looks highly improbable on theism. It seems like on theism, since one religion is going to be, have truth at its core and it's going to actually be the source of ultimate meaning and value, these should stand out above mere human institutions, above mere secular human institutions impressively, and yet they don't seem to. Now, I think there is one major problem with this argument that I want to mention, and that's that the argument may not properly take into account the total evidence, and some of you may have had this problem in the back of your mind. So what do I mean by this? What I mean is that in order to properly evaluate at least part of this argument, the part of this argument that appeals to ethical information, there's a ton of ethical information out there about how believers behave in their lives and about how religions have acted in the world. And whether or not some of those ethical facts actually support or do not support this argument is going to be in dispute. So let me just bring up one example. Consider the cause of holding back LGBT equality or promoting LGBT equality. Now, I personally believe that to hold back LGBT equality, to campaign against LGBT equality is a very morally bad, horrific thing. But many believers might believe the opposite. They might think that, in fact, that's a good thing because that's part of what their religion teaches, right? Part of their value system is to say, look, it's good to try and prevent these, these immoral sexual ethics from being promoted. And so one of the problems here is that whether or not you think that one religion stands out, or whether or not you think that people who adhere to theism lead more impressive ethical lives, is going to depend on what you take the proper value judgments to be about these particular ethical issues, right? If you're someone who's like a really conservative Christian, you might point to Christians and say, hey, look, people like this are campaigning for good things like opposing abortion and holding back equality for LGBT people. Well, I would do the exact opposite and point to those things as examples of believers leading bad ethical lives. So the problem is that when you consider the total evidence, it looks like it's going to be in dispute whether some of these facts obtain. So I have a few notes to make about this counter. So first of all, I should note from the outset that this is my case, my personal case for being an atheist. These are my reasons for being an atheist. And as I said at the very start of the series, some of these reasons are going to be person dependent. They won't fully transfer across people. And this may just be one example of a case where this is an argument that's really a person-dependent argument, right? Based on my ethical system, based on what I think is good and bad, I think it's very obvious and just blindingly clear that holding back equality is a very bad thing. And so if theism were true, you wouldn't expect its adherents to engage in that sort of horrible ethical action. And in general, I don't see, based on what seems to me to be the most plausible account of right and wrong, that believers or religions more often align with right than align with wrong. But I recognize that this may not transfer people who have value judgments very different from me. So this is sort of different from something like the problem of evil, where we can all agree that things like murder and torture and genocide are bad. It relies on much more controversial claims about value. But that doesn't mean it takes away from being a good person-dependent reason for myself and people who share these kind of judgments. Now, one way you might try to adjust the argument that I've heard the advocates of this argument suggest is you might say, look, let's just focus on uncontroversial claims about value, right? I mentioned like really controversial ethical issues like abortion or LGBT equality, but we all agree on some shared moral tenets. Like we all think that like rape and genocide and torture and these sorts of things are bad. And if we just focus on those categories, you might say, look, even when we restrict the data to those categories, those uncontroversial claims about value, then it doesn't look like religions have been a force for good and bad. Or it doesn't look like religions have been a more impressively a source for good than a source for bad, and it doesn't look like, for instance, adherents to theism have impressively been more ethical than non-believers. My problem with that, I think that does work, and if you do that, you do see that there is no clear religion that stands out. But then you're only looking at an artificial subset of the evidence. You're not looking at the total evidence, and in the end, you have to consider the total evidence. So a believer could retort, sure, if you do that, that's true, but it's going to be completely swamped when we consider the total evidence, and my total evidence includes the fact that believers do lead more ethical lives when you would take into account these other ethical issues that they behave well towards that non-believers do not behave well towards. So that's my main problem with that sort of adjustment to the argument. So in the end, I think this is an interesting argument, and I should note that the objection I just made, even if successful, doesn't completely undercut this argument, because I didn't only appeal to claims about ethics. I also appealed to religions not being super impressive in other ways. For instance, like holy text containing lots of out-of-date, false, or scientifically inaccurate information, right? There's no holy text that clearly stands out as the pinnacle of meaning or truth. And I think in general, even if believers might say, hey, look, like on certain issues, religious believers do behave more ethically, it's very clear that there's no religion that completely stands out really, really impressively, right? It's plausible to think that religions are man-made institutions. Like there's no text where you're like, wow, it's unbelievable that this was written in this text, or there's no religion where you're like, it's unbelievable that these things occurred. So I think that for both of those reasons, this argument's still going to work even in the face of that objection, but I do think that's an important objection that makes this a partially person-dependent argument. One note I want to make here that's particularly interesting when it comes to Christianity is when it comes to things like Jesus' teachings, I actually find that there's a lot more insight into the nature of our lives, the purpose of our lives, our ability to overcome suffering, the way to achieve happiness, the way to achieve a loving mind in the writings of Buddhism and the Buddha than Jesus. I think that the Buddha had a much more compelling insight into the ultimate root of our problems and the way to overcome minds that are filled with anger or various other sort of delusional states than someone like Jesus. To me, Jesus had pretty standard sort of moral teachings, where the Buddha really had deeper insights into these things. And the Buddha predated Jesus, and so was more impressive in that sense. I'm just noting that as an aside because that's specifically about Christianity, and this video series is about theism in general. But as you can probably tell, I'm sort of slating it towards Western monotheism and Christianity in particular, just because that's the culture I've been raised in and the arguments that have most interested me. So the next argument that I'm going to cover is the argument from Nonresistant Nonbelief, also known as the divine hiddenness argument, which is an argument many of you will be familiar with. It was popularized by J.L. Schellenberg, and I think it is quite an interesting argument. So the data that this argument works with is the existence of non-resistant non-believers. So these are people who lack a belief in God and yet are open to having such a belief. So for instance, think about atheists and agnostics who may wish to believe in God, wish to affirm the proposition of theism, and in fact really hope that theism is true, but simply are unable to due to other factors like being convinced by the arguments against theism. These are examples of sort of modern day non-resistant non-believers, but of course throughout history there are many examples of such people who are completely open to believing in God and having a relationship with God, but have not been able to bring themselves to believe in God and therefore have that relationship. And this includes people who've lacked a concept of theism altogether. I think this is a sort of neglected group of people when we're talking about non-resistant non-believers. So even today, there are uncontacted tribes, that is to say, groups of people who are completely insulated from the outside world and so have never even had access to the concept of theism. So they're sort of non-resistant non-believers by definition, because you can't resist something that you have no access to, that you've never heard of, and of course you can't believe in something that you have no idea of. So this is another example of non-resistant non-believers, and there are many, many, many such people throughout history, right? There are many instances of people who have never even had access to the concept of theism. So I should note at this stage that one kind of response to this argument would be to doubt the existence of non-resistant non-believers. People have suggested things like, well, there are often hidden resistances that we have that we can't really see, or the noetic effects of sin affect everything. I'm not going to fully go into this objection in this video. I may do so at a later stage. But I think this is quite a bad objection, so I don't think it's not really the one I want to address because I don't think it's the best one. In particular, I think the cognitive science of religion shows that the reason that people don't believe in God isn't because of hidden resistances or anything. It's just because of the way that certain people are predisposed. It's because of deficiencies in agency, cognition abilities. For instance, it has nothing to do with hidden resistances or sinfulness. And so that's just a hint of why I don't find it compelling, but I'm not going to fully go into this objection again. So I'm going to address objection I think is much better, but before I do that, I need to explain why I think that non-resistant non-believers are more expected on naturalism than on theism. So let's start with theism. Now, on theism, correct belief plausibly realizes many important goods, right? So it seems like God would want or desire people to have correct beliefs about him. That is to say, to actually think that theism is true. Why is this? Well, one of the most prominent goods associated with correct belief is a relationship with God, right? It seems like in order to have a relationship with someone, you need to believe that they exist. And so because of this, it's highly plausible that on theism, God would care about you having a correct belief in him. Now, if God is all-loving, that also seems to imply that God would always be open to a relationship with creatures, right? It seems like part of love is desiring a relational, personal interaction with other beings, right? To engage in communion with other beings, to be able to impart important teachings to beings. So for that reason, it seems like God would always be open to a relationship with creatures, that is to be receptive to one. But that implies that anyone who's not actively resisting belief in God should actually believe in God, because since God's open to such a relationship, and God has all the resources to facilitate such a relationship, if there are people who are completely open to that relationship, God would presumably enter into a relationship with them. He'd make his presence known to them. So this is a one strong reason to think that there wouldn't be non-resistant non-believers on theism, but this mainly focuses on this idea of having a relationship with God as the reason that you wouldn't expect non-resistant non-believers, right? It associates this good of having a relationship with God with correct belief. But of course, there are many other goods that you might associate with correct belief that we could cite here as reasons that God would want to ensure that people who aren't actively resisting the concept of theism would actually believe in theism, right? Correct belief plausibly also is important for getting access to important knowledge about salvation, about ethical information. It seems good in general to have metaphysical beliefs that are correct, to have access to doctrines that are correct. So correct belief plausibly entails all these important goods, which means God would care about it, which means God would make efforts to ensure that people who aren't actively resisting such a belief would actually come to acquire that belief, would be able to enter into that belief. On naturalism, on the other hand, non-resistant non-believers are highly expected. This is for two reasons. First of all, on naturalism, theism is false, right? So no matter how much you want a belief to be true, that isn't necessarily going to make you believe it, right? There's no entity out there that can actually facilitate that relationship if you really want to believe it and you're not actively resisting it. In fact, because theism is false, you might come to, through rational inquiry, doubt that theism is true, and so even though you really want to believe it, you end up not believing it. So that's the first reason. The second reason is from the cognitive science of religion evidence that I've talked about previously in the series, which talks about how people are just going to be evolutionarily predisposed in certain instances against believing in God, and then for a variety of cultural and social reasons, in addition to evolutionary ones, just are never going to believe in God, even if they're not actively resisting belief in God. Right? There's no mechanism, for instance, through which uncontacted tribes could end up believing in God on naturalism, but there clearly is one on theism. So for this reason, I think non-resistant non-belief is much more expected on naturalism than on theism, and so is evidence against theism. Now, the main objection I want to respond to when it comes to the argument from divine hiddenness, and I should note that this objection doesn't just apply to the argument from divine hiddenness, but applies to parts of the argument that I made from religious diversity and from the cognitive science of religion too. Because in those arguments, I cite this idea that correct belief would be important to God. And this objection basically doubts that you actually need a certain kind of belief in God in order to realize these important goods. So for instance, so far I've been talking about having a relationship with God as if it actually requires propositional assent to theism, right? That is to say that Schellenberg operates by this idea that, look, to have a relationship with someone, you need to believe that they exist. You need to affirm the proposition of theism. But there are some people who have suggested that perhaps, for instance, just participating in the good in some way is enough to have a relationship with God, right? Perhaps atheists and agnostics can have a kind of relationship with God by contributing to the good, by leading ethical lives, by pursuing meaning and virtue and value on their own. And if this is true, then it doesn't look like non-resistant non-believers are unexpected on theism, because it seems like God doesn't actually need people to have a correct belief about him in order to get these essential goods of having a relationship with God. So this is a way to sort of doubt this idea, the sort of focus on the propositional assent to theism as the thing that realizes these essentially important goods, and therefore doubt the idea that God would really care about propositional assent to theism. I have a few responses to this argument. My first response is that as long as correct belief in God realizes some essential good, these arguments that I make get off the ground, right? One kind of argument you can make, and the argument Schellenberg focuses on, is to say, look, in order to have a relationship with God, you need to have correct belief about God. But that's not the only good that's plausibly associated with correct belief about God on theism, right? I already mentioned that there are a lot of other possible routes for thinking that God would care about correct belief. These are things like, for instance, having access to important ethical information and doctrines. Just having a correct belief in general about the ultimate meaning, purpose, source of the universe seems like it would be inherently a good thing. And of course, many theists suppose that things like salvation, access to the correct scripture and teachings are all contingent on having a correct belief about God. So it seems like there are plausible reasons for thinking that correct belief in God realizes some essential goods, and this is enough to get these arguments off the ground. Because as long as correct belief realizes some essential goods, then God's going to desire that we have correct beliefs about him, which is going to lead you to expect that God ensures that people who aren't actively resisting him, for instance, end up believing in him. So that's my first response. And there's a very related issue here for people who make this objection, and that's that suppose that we do now admit that none of those arguments work, and in fact, there's no essentially important good that's associated with correct belief in God, so God wouldn't care about whether you correctly believe in him. This is going to create other issues that I'm going to address in my third response to this objection here. But before I do that, I want to very quickly doubt this idea that this alternative way of having a relationship with God is enough to undercut this argument. So remember that one version of this argument goes like this. You say, look, you tell me I need to have propositional assent to theism in order to have a relationship with God. But it seems like there are other ways in which atheists and non-believers, for instance, could still have a relationship with God. For instance, perhaps just participating in the good in some way is enough to have a relationship with God. And what I want to say is, let's grant that. Let's suppose that, in fact, participating in being ethical and living a meaningful life is a way of having a relationship with God. That doesn't preclude relational personal love still being a good worth pursuing, one that could deepen one's existing relationship with God. It seems like the most plausible idea here is that there are different modes of love. There are different forms of love, right? Maybe one form of love and having a relationship is just engaging in ethics and moving yourself towards the good. But that doesn't preclude the idea that in addition, having a specific relational personal interaction with God would also be a version of a relationship that would be important to pursue, right? If God, and this is especially true if God is a person, right? If God is a person, it looks very plausible that one can have this kind of relationship with God, because this is exactly what love and relationship with a person usually looks like. So in other words, we can accept this idea that participation in the good is one kind of way of having a relationship with God, and say, look, that wouldn't preclude it being good for you to also have this additional other mode of that relationship that is a specific personal love with God that would require correct belief in God. And this is especially plausible given that many believers report having exactly such a relationship and benefiting from it and thinking it's immensely valuable, right? To deny that there's any additional good gained by having this specific relational personal love with God above and beyond, for instance, just participating in the good, is to be radically out of line with what many believers report about their relationship with God. So it seems like we can make we can sort of make a big concession to this argument and admit that the objection is rooted in a true premise that you still can get some kind of relationship with God without affirming the proposition that theism is true, and still run the argument by saying, look, but it's still true that affirming the proposition of theism gets you to a deeper version of that relationship or another kind of relationship with God that would still be worth pursuing and that God would still want to realize. And I think that denying this has the significant problem of being in contradiction with what a lot of believers actually report about their belief in theism. The third response I want to give sort of cycles back to that first response and says, look, suppose everything I've said up to this point is wrong. Suppose that in fact, correct belief isn't really necessary for any important good. Well, then that seems to imply that correct belief isn't very important to God, right? God doesn't really care whether you have a correct belief about it. Because if correct belief was associated with some essentially important good, then obviously God would care about whether we have a correct belief in him. But this would mean that if you take this response, you have to give up this idea, so these key commitments of sectarian theism. For instance, salvation being dependent on belief in God. Right? Salvation is of the utmost importance, and so if salvation is dependent on correct belief in God, then God would clearly care about whether you have a correct belief in him. Additionally, things like proselytization have to be given up, right? This idea that you should spread correct belief to other people. If God doesn't care about whether you have a correct belief in him, then it seems like proselytization can't be all that important. So the point is that in general, sectarian theism emphasizes that correct belief in God, and in the sense that you actually affirm the proposition that theism is true, is important. And so if you want to adopt this approach, you have to take a very liberal sort of universalist approach to Christianity or to theism, which some people aren't going to mind, but is going to come at a significant cost, I think. And I should also note that this argument is elaborated upon in depth in a book by Robert McKim on divine hiddenness. That's excellent. So if you want to see the full account of this argument, I would highly recommend that book. One part of this argument that I haven't been able to address is a third possibility, which is to say, look, God does care about correct belief. Correct belief is important to God, but there are other factors that outweigh that fact that compel God to remain hidden. In other words, correct belief is important to God, but God has other countervailing reasons to remain hidden, despite the fact that correct belief is important to God. So that'd be another way to sort of take this approach, and that way you wouldn't have to give up on these key commitments to sectarian theism, but I think that approach has other problems. I don't think that the considerations offered in favor of why God will want to remain hidden are compelling. But I elaborate on that in depth on my paper on the cognitive science of religion, where I also summarize this argument that Robert McKim gives in much greater detail. So if you're interested in this general line of responses, I would highly recommend that you check out those papers. Okay, my fourth response to this, and this isn't so much of a response to the objection, but a concern, is that I think participation in the good looks pretty vague. Remember this, there's this idea that by participating in the good, you're still getting a kind of relationship with God. It's a different way of having that relationship other than actually affirming that God exists in the propositional sense. But to me, it looks very ambiguous what that means. Like, do you need to have some sort of moral faculty to be able to participate in the good? Like, do you need to be aware that you're taking ethical actions? Can animals participate in the good? Like, what range of creatures actually apply to this? It seems like any attempt to narrow this definition is going to include some creatures, and then so bring back the problem of divine hiddenness, because the question becomes, why don't those creatures end up having correct belief in God, or why doesn't God open himself up to a relationship with them? Or alternatively, if you leave it broad enough so that it can include all the relevant creatures that you would want to include, it still looks so vague that it looks a bit ad hoc and hard to justify. So I don't really think that this is necessarily the biggest problem. I think that there are ways to amend it, but I just think people who want to offer this objection need to be very careful to delineate exactly what they mean when they give this alternative suggestion, because the kind of relationship they're suggesting is not the one that we traditionally understand to be associated with being a person. And so I think they just need to be careful to expand on that in a way that is going to look compelling. All right, everyone, so we have gotten to the end of this particular part of the series. So just as a quick summary, I've argued that 10 key pieces of evidence favor naturalism over theism, and that is humans, evolution, the dependence of mind on the physical, the cognitive science of religion, the success of naturalistic explanation, suffering, the ineffectiveness of prayer, religious diversity, flawed religions, and non-resistant non-belief. And specifically, I've argued that this is evidence against theism in that we would be more likely to observe this data if naturalism is true than if theism were true. Now, obviously, we can't only examine the evidence that is taken to favor naturalism over theism. We need to look at the evidence that is taken to favor theism and then weigh the two. And so that's exactly what I'm going to do in the next part of this series. I'm going to look at data that is generally taken to be evidence for theism, and I'm going to look at necessary existence, that is really cosmological arguments, fine-tuning, consciousness, moral knowledge, beauty, and religious experience. And I'm going to argue that this evidence is less impressive than the data that favors naturalism for a multitude of reasons. Additionally, I'm going to argue that theistic evidence in general tends to suffer from two key fatal flaws that doesn't afflict most naturalistic evidence. So stay tuned for the next video to hear about what that is. So thank you everyone for watching. I hope you're enjoying these series. Feel free to comment with your thoughts. Please like the video and subscribe if you've enjoyed this part of the series, and follow me on Twitter, follow my blog below, and I will see you all next time.